One of my favorite things to talk about is SharePoint's document management features. I'm not quite sure why that is. Probably because I try to be a very organized person. Probably because I've worked long enough with computers to see some really messy systems when people don't know how to kind of keep house and keep things tidy. And just because I've also seen a lot of people who get very frustrated with computers because they can't find what they're looking for or don't know what the latest content is. So for all of those reasons, this is one of my favorite things to talk about in SharePoint. One of the most powerful things that I think you can use with SharePoint, but we want to make sure that you understand what versioning, check-in and check-out, and content approval can actually do for you. We're actually going to start with the most complicated, I guess, of the three types, and that's versioning, just to get it out of the way, and then the other two will seem like a piece of cake. So when we talk about versioning or any one of these features, what you need to know is what is the purpose of using it, because none of them have to be used. When you work with libraries and they don't use any of these features, your library basically becomes just like the network or saving things onto your hard drive. You save a file, somebody opens it up, if they make a change to it and they save it, then it simply gets overwritten and now the new version is sitting out there on the hard drive. If somebody does a save as, that's when you get into kind of the messy stuff because you can have 15 different versions of the same file sitting out there, some that may have different names. Some may end in version 1, version 2. Some may end with a date. Others may have somebody's initials on them. It's hard to say, but that's where it gets messy. So the first thing to say is, why do we need versioning? And the purpose is to keep a history of document changes. Also, so if necessary, you can revert back to a prior version. That means if you're working along and you're writing up to the deadline and somebody goes, oh my gosh, somebody made an edit and they deleted 5 pages of our content, it's not a big deal. With versioning, you can simply say, go back to the version that was good. It's also important to know that each version saves a complete copy of the file. Now, as a user, you probably don't care too much about that. Technically, that can start to take up a lot of space, but there's things that administrators know how to do and how to work with that really don't make that an issue either. But as far as you're concerned, because it keeps a complete copy for every version, that's why we can go back and look at prior versions and even revert the file back to a prior version. Now, in addition to just those basics of why you might want to do versioning, versioning comes with options. Your administrator will decide which one of these options to use. But one of the options is whether you want to keep versions at all. If you do, whether you want to keep major versions, also called a published version, or if you want to keep major and minor versions. And minor versions are sometimes called drafts. And we'll work through this so you understand it, because this can be one of those confusing topics. So, if versioning is turned on, you will either be saving major or published versions or major and minor versions, otherwise known as drafts. The main difference as far as we're concerned is the numbering. Major or published versions are just numbers, number 1, number 2, number 3. If you're using minor versions, then they're going to have a decimal place, 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. And then when that minor version becomes published to a major version, that's when it'll change to the next whole number. 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 2.0, 2.1, 2.2, and so forth. Again, I'll give you a good example of this here in just a minute to help you understand it a little bit better. As a user, as a person who's working with editing Word and Excel and PowerPoint files, if you are prompted to enter a version comment, I always want you to do that. It's very important. Now, don't make this too difficult. All you need to do is say, what did you do to the file? I ran a spell check. I added section 5. I edited page 23. Just so people who are working with the versions know, without having to open the file, what that particular version did. It becomes part of a history. So even though adding a comment is technically not required, I would like to make it required. You should always do it as a part of common courtesy and as a part of history of the document. You may or may not have permissions to delete versions. But if you do, just know that when a version is deleted, it does not go to the recycle bin. This is just one of those things that you need to be careful about. Now, let's get on to an example. Let's say that you are working in your office, and you're working with a group of maybe 5 people. And these 5 people have permissions to edit documents in a library. Everybody else in the company can read documents in the library, but only these 5 people have editing permissions. How might documents look that go into that library? So remember that when no versioning is turned on, Storing documents in a library is pretty much like storing them on the network or on the LAN. That means that when a file is first added, it gets stored to the library. When it's edited or saved, those changes simply replace the original file. There's always and will only be one copy of the document in SharePoint. And of course, because there's no versioning, no history is being kept. This makes it simple and it makes it clean. But again, it's pretty much like the network, so you're really not taking advantage of what SharePoint can offer. But remember that anybody with at least read permissions can see the file. So the big changes happen when we start using versioning. And one way to do that is to work with major versioning. That means when the file is first added, it becomes version 1. When it's edited for the first time and saved, it becomes version 2. Each time it's edited, it can be reviewed. And of course, the history is logged. This means that you can revert back to any prior version, as well as just look at how a document evolved over time. The latest version is visible in the main library. All of the other versions are going to be visible by accessing the document's history, and we'll see how to do that when we do our demo. Each version can be seen by anyone with read permissions. So in that aspect, it's similar to no versioning, except now we do have copies every time a change is made. Let's take on the last one, which is with major and minor versioning enabled. Once again, when the file is first uploaded, it becomes 1, but this time it's 1.0. And when changes are made and saved, instead of becoming 2, 3, 4, it becomes a decimal point, 1.1, 1.2, and so forth. The main difference is that usually this means only editors, those with editing permissions, can see the minor versions or the drafts, the ones with the decimal places. Everyone can still see 1.0, even though the editors have now made a couple of changes. But 1.1 and 1.2 are visible only to those with editing permissions. When the editing team is done with it, they're going to go ahead and publish it to the next major version. That means in our scenario, 1.2 is going to become 2.0. And at that point, everybody with at least read permissions to the library will be able to see 2.0. I know it may seem complicated, but when you start working with versioning, it actually becomes pretty obvious what's happening. And SharePoint is also good about only showing you what you need to see. So if you're a user and you're not an editor, it's going to be simple. You will only see the last published version that you have rights to see. Well, let's take on the easier ones. Now that we've gotten that hard one out of the way. One of those is called check-in and check-out. The purpose of check-in and check-out is to prevent more than one person from editing the same document at the same time. When this is enabled, a document must be checked out. So when you go to a library and you try to edit a Word or an Excel file, you'll be told that it must be checked out, and your only option is to say OK. When you check out a document, you are given a copy, and that's the one that you will be editing. And that's your copy to keep as long as you want. The original file does remain available as read-only in the library, so you're not keeping people from accessing the document. They just can't edit the document. When you're finished editing the document, you're going to check it back in, and the copy that you had with all of your wonderful changes is simply going to replace the old document, and that means that everybody will be able to see your wonderful changes. Now remember, check-in and check-out can be used on its own, with or without versioning. They do not have to be used together. This feature, unlike versioning, doesn't have variations in it. It's either on or it's off. Likewise, the feature called Content Approval is also very simple. Its purpose is to control when a new or edited document is visible to those who can read library content. Only people with administrator permissions can approve content. This is going to be your list or your site admins or other people with administrator privileges. Their option is to leave it as pending, to approve it, or to reject it. That means when you edit or upload a new document, it's going to be in pending status. When it's in pending status, only you as the author and the admins can see it. Nobody else who has access to the library will be able to see it yet. They won't be able to see it until it's approved. The admins will be the ones who will approve the content. Once they mark it as approved, then instantly everybody can see your document. Now, there also is a third option, and that is that the admins could reject your document. Why might they do that? Maybe you put it in the wrong library. Maybe it needs to be edited a little more, or the quality is off a little bit. Hopefully, they'll tell you why it's rejected and give you a chance to fix it. What you need to remember, though, is that we only have a very few reasons why you might not be able to see a document in a library that somebody else tells you is there and that they can see. One is that you're not in the right location. The second is that they have permissions in that library that you don't. And the third, now that we've talked about content approval, is that they are the author or the editor and therefore can see it because it's still pending, but you can't because it hasn't been approved yet. Like check-in and check-out, this feature is either on or it's off. So the document management features in SharePoint are really part of the truly powerful and exciting parts of working with documents here, really one of the advantages. We now know that different libraries can specialize in different types of files, like a slide library, for example. There are some physical size and file type limitations to what can be stored in libraries. Those will be set or determined by your particular implementation of SharePoint, so check if you need to know what those limitations are. If enabled, documents must be checked out in order to edit them. Even when they're checked out, though, others will still be able to read the documents in the library. Versions, however, help you keep a history of changes to a document. Instead of just having one copy, you can now go back and see the history of changes. If you're using drafts, then drafts can be published to major versions. Major versus minor is mainly two different things. Who can see it? Usually only people with editing permissions can see drafts. And secondly, the numbering. Are they whole numbers or decimals? And lastly, content approval helps control who can view new or changed content until an administrator approves it and says it's good content or that it's in the right place. We also know that our Office files, like Word and Excel, have always had properties. But in SharePoint, they now become synonymous with library columns. Basically, we can view and edit our file properties either in the document itself or from within the SharePoint library. While I know this can seem overwhelming, we're going to go through some demonstrations and you'll see that they really are very intuitive and kind of a natural way to work. Once you use them just a couple of times, all of these document management features will become very simple and they'll make sense because they're going to help you take that mess that used to be your folders on the network and really organize them and keep them in good shape so that you can see them and know what good content is there.